In case you encounter any technical issues accessing or using this online platform, just directly reach out to me or Jose, who speaks really good French. And lastly, we'll have a 3.5-hour session, which is quite long. We'll have a 30-minute coffee break. But if you'd like to have additional 5 or 10-minute break, just let me know, and I'll talk to Alex and see what we can do. Does that sound okay to you? All right. So now let us welcome our trainer, Alex Grech. Alex is an academic and the founding director of the Commonwealth Center for Connected Learning, or 3CL Foundation. So Alex has been working in ed tech, advising on different issues, including digital education policy, 21st century skills, and lifelong learning. Alex, are you with us now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. So greetings, all of you. I'm sorry I can't be there. It's a bit of a surreal experience, actually. Doing this, I am 45 minutes flight away from Libya. I am 1 hour flight away from Rome. And yet, this year, all I've heard really is that we really need to focus on Africa and empowering Africa. I'm going to try and share my slides now. And again, sharing slides in this kind of environment is always a bit challenging. So I am going to be relying on Hanjan to be my eyes and my ears. I need is a technical check back from Hanjan. Hanjan, can you hear me properly? Can you see the screen? Because I'm completely blindsided at the moment. Sorry, Hanjan, you can? Is that yes? Because the sound has gone completely from my end. Yeah, I can't really hear you, but I'm assuming it's a yes. Okay, so if it's a no, just let me know via WhatsApp. As I said, this is going to be an exercise in patience, in resilience. It's a long session. I think we should, whenever we get tired, and I will certainly get as tired as you are, we should get up, stand up, or have a break. This is a long session with a very long title, which I guess I'm going to spend most of my time trying to deconstruct for you as to what we mean. But first, I want to start on something which is context. Because for me, context is everything, and context is me trying to help you, whoever you are, and I don't know you, and you and your individual country context, which is spectacularly, I guess, interesting at this stage, I guess, in the development of technology. What you need to know about me is that I've been in the process of change, in the business of change all my life. I'm somebody who escaped my country when I was in my early 20s, went to work for technology companies with a business degree. So I worked for Reuters and Hitachi in European jobs, and then went back to my country, my tiny country, to help it join the EU. But for the last, I guess, 20-something years of my life, I've been increasingly in the business of policy making. I guess I've advised a couple of prime ministers for education. I'm still an advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs in my country. What's relevant to you is that I guess I come from an advocacy for lifelong learning. I am a lifelong learner. I'm somebody who decided to do a PhD for fun when I was in my mid-40s, for instance. And I also teach new media at the University of Malta. I'm interested in how new technologies from social media to the blockchain, I guess, are changing our lives, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. So in terms of your context, I think we'll talk a bit about that, I think, as we go along. I have a lot to learn about what your specific contexts are like. So this has to be a bit of a two-way process, even though the media that we are using is not, that two-way. At the moment, I'm in broadcast mode. I'm looking at a screen. I'm looking at a picture. If I do Alt Tab on my screen, I can vaguely see that there are people in a room. And we'll do the best that we can in these circumstances. I want to talk to you a bit about the knowledge base, whatever it is I'm going to be sharing with you, because, in the TVET world, when it comes to the labor market, a lot of things are subjective. So everybody has a bit of a stand. Everybody has a bit of a worldview on these things. Yesterday, I was sneaking in, half listening, I think for half an hour, to what Guillaume was doing. I thought it was amazing. And I've just listened to the sum up of what you guys did yesterday, and I thought it was very pertinent in terms of the words that I was hearing, and the idea of resilience and networks and frameworks and empowerment. All of these things point to one thing: change, the need for change, the appetite for change. What you've got in front of you is some of the things I've done, which might have some relevance to these things. I guess you can see blockchain in some of these things. I've always been interested in disruptive technologies and decentralized technologies. In other words, technologies with no real power in the center, but diffused for the gain of the citizen, I guess. So I'm always, I think when it comes to the education sector, the TVET sector, I am always on the side of the learner. Ideologically, that's where I am. And the second thing is, I guess I had done a piece of work which I will be levering on for UNESCO and the ILO. I think it was published last year. It's called the Digitization of TVET and Skill Systems. And a lot of the slides I'm going to be sharing with you are from that particular report. You may or may not be familiar with it. There may well be no surprises, because the way we ran this large-scale report was to go out in the field and ask people, you, the experts, as to what works and what doesn't work. I think the other thing you need to be aware of is that I have some experience working with politicians. I have some experience working with policymakers. And I have some experience with trying to get things done. And I think this is what Olivier was mentioning yesterday to you in terms of resilience. They need to be strong, that the pathway is never straight or academic, that sometimes you have to keep your target in front of you, and sometimes you have to go sideways and backwards, but to keep those targets in front of you. And we will talk about those targets, even though I know that they've been mentioned yesterday. So I think one of the things I had done in this part of the world, and this is simply as an example as to what small countries, but also emerging countries can do as a model for other people. For example, I have project managed the first use of blockchain technologies for the issuing of certificates, digital certificates for the TVET sector. In my country, right now, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, when he or she leaves school, thinks nothing of the fact that, yes, here's your certificate. By the way, it's already been digitalized. If you download this app, and they will download the app, this certificate has now been notarized on the blockchain, and nobody else can take the certificate away from you, even if the issuing institution has disappeared. Or even in some cases, as in my part of the world, we are clearly on the refugee trail in my country. So we've had issues with people arriving here from Syria who have to be retrained. The university doesn't even exist anymore, or the training college doesn't even exist anymore. And yet they've been trained again. And once they get the certificate, it's very ceremonial that this is notarized using a disruptive technology, a decentralized technology, to make sure that the certificate belongs to the recipient, even if the issuing agency has disappeared. I'm using this as an example because from what we did here, that the government of the Bahamas had sent an entire delegation here, and what people did in the Bahamas, which was much more sophisticated than what we did. I am a huge believer in countries that seem to be in developing mode, taking a leap and leading others. And my feeling is that is where many of your countries are right now. Okay, so besides this document, I've also been like skim reading the kind of material that Jose and Olivier and Henjan have been sending me. I've looked at this training module packages. There's a lot of material over there. So I am going to try, in whatever time this is going to take us, to try and get all of this stuff to one place that it may be useful to you. Now, again, my emphasis will always be on getting something done as opposed to developing reports. Okay, I'm at an age, I'm 60 years old. When you get to my age, you start thinking not just on legacy, but because you're obsessed with time, that you're going to get something done within, say, a 5-year timeline. And I would suggest, no matter how young you are, and I know that many of you are much younger than me, I think the idea of applying change in bite-sized bits might be some way of going through this. Okay. So anyway, these are my guides. Okay. My, 20, 30 years of mistakes dealing with the public sector and dealing with industry and dealing with the labor market and setting up the National Skills Council, for instance, in this country, and trying to get something done. I don't need to emphasize this, but training is part of a longer road trip. I think this is what you're familiar with. So this is a starting point. I think it's also a very exciting starting point. I always love these kind of initiatives that you can go back and literally put your finger on a date and say something started to happen. And from my conversations right now with Olivier, with Jose and Henjan, I think there's a lot of determination that something will happen. And I really like the idea of empowering people at country level. This thing is not going to happen unless one or two of you in specific countries decide to take a leadership role. I think there will be many more reports published. Getting something done is something different. So the longer road trip is what we're talking about. When I was thinking of how to try and skin this in a way, I literally went back and thought of what are we talking about here? And you start looking at words. Okay, so things like the overall objective is to create an ecosystem that will enable and accelerate the digital transformation of TVET and skills developments in Africa. And immediately you say, whoa, that's quite a lot being done here. And then in other documents and in other slides, which were kindly shared with me, I start reading about the overall ecosystem target. And as a result, let's achieve a minimum of, again, then I found 10 targets for African continent countries to adopt these targets then in 50% of those African countries by 2030. So again, I'm now thinking, okay, there's words I think we need to deconstruct there. We all need to be on the same page if we're going to go and achieve some of these targets, I guess. And then it's like my objective when I started speaking to Olivier very late today, and Olivier said, well, we'd like you to create these country guidelines to help you, not me, help you diagnose, assess the level of preparedness in your country for the digital transformation of TVET and skills development in Africa. So my first instinct was, well, there's a lot of big words there that I think we're going to need to deconstruct to make sure we're all on the same page. And I'm quite aware of the fact that some of this work might have happened yesterday, but I think there's no harm in reminding ourselves. So I think the questions I was asking myself was, an ecosystem, what do we mean by that? 10 ecosystem targets, what are those? What do we mean by them? What do we mean by a diagnostic assessment? The only advantage I found of having a PhD and being called doctor, at least in my country, is that you can get appointments at the hospital by calling them and saying, I'm Dr. Alex Grech. But the idea of a diagnostic assessment seems a very surgical, distanced kind of thing to do. And yet my experience of driving change, not just in my country, but at least in my part of the world, is that change can also always be a bit messy. So diagnosis implies a scientific approach to understanding what's going on. And then what's the level of preparedness? Who's ready and who isn't it? That's what we should be talking about. And I think this is where these country guidelines that I have to come up with to help you should really be trying to ask those questions. How ready are you? And really, what do we mean by the digital transformation of TVET and skills development systems in Africa? So this is almost like my dashboard, my starting point as I kind of struggle to dive into this project, speaking to people. Where do we want to go? So I'm going to start with this issue of an ecosystem. Now, this is not the first word you've heard this word, or I've heard this word. In fact, I would almost say it's like the word of the year. I think every single talk I've done, I do a lot of this kind of stuff around the world. Everybody always talks about an ecosystem. And I always find it difficult to understand, are we all talking about the same thing? So I'm going to start with a definition of what do we mean by an ecosystem. And if you look at the definition, it means a community network of interactions between organisms and their environment. In other words, you can't have an ecosystem if it's just one person living on his or her own in a room like I am right now. But outside my room, I can see my garden. I can see, if I open my room and I start to interact with other organisms there, my cat, my wife, I guess. But I would ask you to look at these visuals in a way that networks for people and technology mean those things. Networks are blurry things. If you're looking at literature, I particularly want you to focus on the tree, because the tree can be a really interesting analogy for what is an ecosystem, and particularly within the sector that we're looking at right now. So an ecosystem in a tree. What I'm going to share with you, the next couple of slides, are from a paper by a Dutch media scholar called Jose van Dijk. And the paper is called Seeing the Forest for the Trees. And her focus was visualizing platformization and its governance. Now, before we all get scared and say trees and platforms, what is this guy talking about? Remember, platform is also almost like the word of the year, Just see what's happening right now with Facebook becoming Meta, a technology that we trust, we think, and then Facebook went down, a month ago, and the whole internet went down. Various people worried about this technology that we're relying on, not just to connect like this, but also, to help us, monitor the temperature in our fridge or even open the doors to our houses. So Van Dijk's ecosystem really looks at the tree and looks at what's above the ground, this part of the tree, which says the sectorial. She looks at the trunk and she says, well, there are platforms, right? Platforms, let's say technologies, which you can see. There are intermediary platforms or stuff that you can also see, but there's also a hell of a lot of stuff happening, above the ground. And yet us humans, we only see these bits, don't we? Particularly those of you who, like me, are interested in policy and strategy, and sometimes less in how things work. We just want the technology to work. And what Van Dijk says is that if you look at the top part of the tree here, so substitute education for TVET, right? So let's say that there's TVET here. And underneath this, these intermediary systems going on, she says, platforms are increasingly at odds, in other words, in conflict with the very narrow legal and economic concepts in which their governance is grounded. So we keep on using these technologies. Sometimes we want to do things with them, but it's also who owns them, these technologies. Are they fit for purpose? And she also says that information ecosystems are very hierarchical, but also interdependent creatures. This is also quite interesting because one is at odds with the other. Hierarchical implies power. But interdependent is, as soon as you're dependent on other things, maybe your power is a bit shaky. Again, keep the Facebook analogy at the back of your mind. And the other thing is that the layered shape of the tree draws attention to the dynamics of power concentration, vertical integration, infrastructuralization, cross-sectorization. And I think that on the side, if you wanted to look at what we see normally, well, at the top with education, I just mentioned this blockchain credentialing, which is happening in Malta, but all the student sees is an app on his or her mobile phone. But underneath that, there's a lot of stuff happening, web browsers. If you want to validate your blockchain certificate, you have to go to blockcerts.org and see what's happening. And we know that some stuff is being, for example, saved on the cloud. So there's Amazon Web Service somewhere. Underneath it is all the stuff we don't see. Computer hardware and devices, your data centers, your internet protocols, your internet exchange points, your cables, your hardware. Stuff we see, stuff we don't see. And also that these trees have very different forms depending on the countries you're in. For example, the one I showed you before was an American format. In my part of the world, which is Europe, where there's much more funding, for instance, for education, than there is in the US, which is much more, private sector funded kind of thing. The tree looks different. But generally, this idea, I think, of having, things you can see, things you can't see, things which are connected to each other, even the basic idea of networks, what we think are networks. I think these are things that we need to keep at the top of our head. Okay. And for example, here's an idea as to what some people think is an education, actually it's a TVET education ecosystem in a small country called Estonia. So you can see that the Estonians are already saying it, and Estonia is a small, very well connected country, I think in terms of technology. Is a country that has a legacy of having been dominated by other countries and always in fear of being invaded. And the Estonians really look at TVET as a means of empowering every single citizen. So in terms of this system here, you can see, the idea of, credentialing and profiling and credits. And you need to look at the legal side of things. You need to look at the security side. You need to worry about pedagogy and quality assurance and certification. And if you go on the left, then there are the fundamentals that I think most of us can agree to or not agree to. And I think it's difficult to disagree with some of these things. Everyone has the right to a quality education. So we can say everybody has the right to TVET education. There are solutions to improve learning can come from anyone and anywhere. This is quite revolutionary, by the way. Okay. Because we are always taught that there are people who know and people who don't know. The Estonians are basically saying that there are people who have knowledge, even if they're not accredited with that knowledge. I know nothing about cars, for instance, despite the fact that I have a PhD. I can just about drive a car. There's somebody who doesn't have a PhD, has a lot of knowledge about my car, and I don't. And if my car breaks down, who is more useful? The person with the PhD or somebody who can fix a car? So the approach here is, and this is simply within the ambience of what is an ecosystem. It's really introducing the idea of technology, philosophical approaches, things you need to be convinced about in your countries. For example, the Estonians are convinced you need a learner-centric approach. You need to lever on the technologies that you have at your hand, but also the idea of scalability, which is another thing I think we need to think about. The idea that you could do something now, could even do something small now, but if you're investing time, money, effort, resources in trying to do something now, it should be capable of getting to do something better next year, as opposed to doing something which is just like to please someone. Okay, to please the UNESCO, the ILO, or the government or something like that. Okay. They also believe that there has to be a sustainable business model to ensure the longevity of what they call community solutions, that all learners must have access to solutions in an inclusive way. But we also need to have infrastructure that allow everyone to propose solutions to the problems that we have. Now, this, again, within the journey that I understand you are going to have to take, is very important. Infrastructure that allows anyone to produce solutions to problems that you're going to face. The one thing I can promise you is that when you are going to start a process of change, you're going to find a lot of problems. Some of them obvious ones, some of them not so obvious. Having infrastructure allows you to get information quickly to the right people so they can make decisions is also, I would suggest, something which is very important. But here you are at this stage. Alex is simply trying to deconstruct what do we mean by an ecosystem. It's complicated. It implies human beings, technologies in an ongoing disruptive relationship, but to try and get something done. And it's important that you're very clear about what you want to get done. And if you want to look at other things, this is specifically my kind of world, where decentralization, and this is again something which tends to be challenging for governments to understand, because most governments are in the business of governance, and governance implies centralization. When you start talking about decentralization, using these technologies, the affordances of technologies, what I normally find is easier is to kind of shift the discussion on learner centricity, the concept of self-sovereignty. I don't have enough time to talk about this, but I can bore you to tears about this. Let's just say the idea that people are in charge of their own identities. And even though we are ascribed our identities by third parties, think of how many people, probably in Africa and in India, don't even have an identity because nobody went to register them somewhere with an authority and give them a birth certificate. Okay, decentralized technologies can address a lot of things which at the moment we know we have problems with. Okay, so the idea of, again, using fluid networks, transparency, the idea of peer exchanges, everything looks fine on paper. What you need to understand at the very beginning is that, okay, hang on a second, because I think Hanjang is trying to get hold of me. Okay, I'm being asked to pause. So we're going to pause for 2 minutes, I understand. I'm going to pause at this slide. Okay. Okay, I understand from Henjan that I can continue, right? Again, to address one of the questions which you might have, don't worry too much about problems with, and I will share my screen in a moment. Don't worry too much about text on my slides. You will get the text later. There's nothing terribly prescriptive about them. I think the intention I have is to try and get us to be on the same page. So you can go back and look at them later. You can also look at, I guess, if you're interested in the material, you know, which we have assimilated in a report. Which, however, and this is the point I want to make, in a report which is now like months old. So my point about making sure that, and again, I'm assuming that you can see my screen now, right? That things change over a period of time. Okay, so I'm going to keep on going on now. We've looked at systems, ecosystems. What do we mean by that? I was intrigued by the 10 targets, and when they arrived, it was like, whoa, you know, there's quite a lot to munch through over here. And partly I was very pleasantly surprised. And I'm sure you've seen this, and I know you discussed this yesterday. I try to deconstruct them in a way from my simple brain, I guess, to try and understand. You know, we started with the whole picture of the pathway, didn't we? You know, there's the road we're going to keep on following from this point onwards. And I think if I had to look at those separately, for example, there are things which are very tangible, and there are things which are seem to be like key performance indicators. And I think assembled together, it implies commitment. And I think if I had to look at this thing, a national network coalition coordination team, this implies ownership. Somebody's driving this. A national report on digital transformation of TVET. I'm saying, okay, it's a national report. It's a country report. So I guess context, which is the first thing I started talking about, is going to be very important. And I guess out of there, you'll get some sort of strategic document. Fine, we understand that. Then there's going to be some generic guidance on how to introduce or reintroduce technology and digital in your TVET program. And we'll talk a bit about this as we go through this session. The idea of a roster of trainers, which is regularly updated, that was one I'm saying, okay, trainers, how many trainers, centralized trainers are they? Is there a registry? How's this going to work? On the other side, I was finding a lot of stuff which is like typical key performance indicators, no? That people will say, have you reached this target or not? And in our world, which is very quantitative, isn't it? People will think that, you know, you haven't got your minimum 100,000, you know, out of school youths having basic skills, you know, you failed. Or you need to get your minimum of 10,000 skilled teachers, okay? These are pretty tough targets to get to, okay? I think the idea of policymakers as ambassadors, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that you are the first, aren't you? The first ambassadors who are understanding this. I kept on hearing about train the trainers, empowering people at country level. I'm assuming you're going to be the first of this 1,000. The idea of having an ICT and digital day in TVET, okay, these are fun things to have, but again, it's a good way of getting networking to happen. This is what's happening today, no? When you're in the room, people network, people talk to each other. I can't be there to be networking with you. I have no visual cues as to how to network with you. I have to rely on these tools to somehow get across to you. That is networking, human engagement. And the other thing, I guess, is that to have this national center of excellence, which would imply a place, jobs, I guess, infrastructure, a brand, all sorts of things. So it's an interesting mix, I think, of ideological stuff on one side and a few more reports on one side. But on the other side is really trying to get some things done, because at the end of the day, you are going to be judged by what's on the right-hand side, I think, of the screen, more than by the left-hand side of the screen. So the way I'm seeing this, and again, please, Jose, jump in if I'm misinterpreting it. This is the acid test for determining success or otherwise of the Pan-African Initiative by 2030. That's what people are going to be holding up in front of you. If I were one of you, I would have those 10 targets. I would put them somewhere on my wall, so I don't lose sight of them. Now, the third thing is more, it's like, what are we trying to do as a start today? This is the first tiny step of doing this diagnostic assessment. And here I'm going to really rely on a couple of things. I think I'm going to go back to my point of departure, which are these training module packages. I don't know if you've seen this document. It's very extensive. There's a lot of stuff there that one can kind of rely on. I think it's there to help. And I'm relying again on this document that I co-authored. Again, it's about 2 years old. One of the things we do talk about there is that the TVET sector, like the education sector, moves very slowly, unfortunately. And one of your challenges, it's almost like having the big elephant in the room now. And how can you jolt that to try and get it to move in the direction you want it to move? So I then started trying to figure out, let me align on the understanding that we're all on the same page of what we think TVET is. Now, I don't know how much time we should or should not spend on this, because the idea of, education, training, and skills development activities related to occupational fields, productions, and livelihoods, these are the standard UNESCO definitions, I guess. Some of these things are a bit more challenging. Transversal skills, what do we mean by that? The idea of transversal or 21st century skills have been around for many years now. And yet most education institutions around the world, particularly in my part of the world, tend to operate in silos. You will study chemistry, you will study biology, you will study English or science, and the two don't mix. And yet the labor market keeps on asking for something very different. The labor market keeps on identifying gaps between people who actually come out of the institution, graduates of TVET or higher education, and say, what can I do with these people? Okay, so variety of learning. And at the secondary, post-secondary, and tertiary levels, so in a way, again, I've seen in my part of the world, a lot of TVET colleges wanted to become universities and are aspiring to be that the learning that they are facilitating is deemed to be at par with that of higher education institutions. I think the concept of vocational education as being accredited, I think, is very important. The idea of continuing professional training, that it's undertaken also as part of people keeping their jobs if they are in a TVET institution. So if you're a chartered accountant, like I was, I still am. I think I still have the warrant somewhere. Okay, you need to do X amount of CPD every year, otherwise you still can't get that warrant done. This idea of CPD, continuing professional development, is something which is very dear to a lot of countries' hearts that have also set up quality assurance regimes. In terms of programs, it can be anything, isn't it, to qualify as TVET? It can be a workshop like a day like this, and you say, I've spent 8 hours listening to somebody here, and as a result, you get a certificate that is deemed to be a TVET program, but it can also be a whole year or 2 years. And there are many players in the field. I don't know specifically in Africa. I know in my part of the world, there's a mix of NGOs, religious groups, donor organizations. But I think in terms of how we do this, and this is where I think digitalization starts to become very interesting. We're moving very quickly from the face-to-face to the hands-on to COVID. Look what COVID did to us. The emergency pivoting of all teaching online within 24 hours in many countries. which exposed a lot of dilemmas for many teaching institutions. Okay, because many people who are in the business of teaching were not very ICT literate, and that's the polite way of doing that. I remember in my university, when this crisis happened overnight, I could see many professors coming up with all sorts of excuses, because the reality was they were terrified. They had never used Zoom or Teams or anything like that in their lifetime, let alone delivered a lecture like I'm trying to do this right now. Okay, so disconnects, I think, is what you can see at the moment, and yet there are many different interpretations of programs which depend on governing structures and provisions and economic and social needs. Again, this is material which you should be familiar with, because this is stuff I'm scraping both from the training needs, and also I remember Olivier being very proud of this slide and telling me, we know how we're going to do this. We know that we're starting here on base 1. We're training TVET leaders. We're going to see how we can start to train people online. This will go all the way up to certification. But on the national level, this is where the hard work actually happens. Okay, how do we embed change in the actual countries? I can hear a bit of noise in the background, so I don't know. And again, if anybody wants to ask a question or even walk around the room, for all I know, I can see you all sitting down there, okay? This is not a comfortable environment, okay, for me to broadcast to you. But I think all of this should be quite familiar territory at the moment. But I think it's like goals, what are we talking about? And this is to try and get back to my territory of, empowering people, promoting employment, decent work. And I will keep on harping about lifelong learning as a word that you can use sometimes to break barriers. Some people get very defensive, when especially if they're in university institutions and say, they're an academic institution, and they will be, they will look at the TVET institution as a quite inferior way. When you start pivoting the argument and start talking about learners, empowering learners, you can soon get people to the same page. Because when you ask an academic and say, aren't you in the business of empowering learners? And this what, whether the learner is going to end up becoming a doctor or going to be somebody who can spray a car well, okay? Aren't you in the same business? Okay, so empowering learners, the idea of social equity. These are all the things that, again, whenever we have big summits, everybody subscribes to them. The question is, does this actually happen in practice? And I think if you look on the other side, and again, this is all standard UNESCO fare, but I'm just putting this in front of you as a way of validation. Do we really believe in this or not? Do you believe in making this happen? Because on the other side, does the encouragement, I guess you can do that, recognition and validation of informal and non-formal learning in my part of the world, good luck. Because many of the quality assurance organizations in my part of the world are very good at accrediting formal education and are absolutely hopeless at accrediting anything else. Maybe my hope is that in Africa, you can do a better job than what Europe has done. So Europe, even though it's got organizations and the EU like CEDEFOP, and I had a chat with these people, before I did this last week. And I said, do you have any material relating to Africa? They said, well, you know how difficult it is to try and get TVET recognized in Europe. I hope they can do better than we did. So this is something to put, quality assurance of informal and informal learning, development of well-articulated outcomes-based qualifications. And then you start to blur, right? Because you have policy, regulatory mechanisms, horizontal and vertical progression, flexible learning pathways, modularization, mutual recognition of qualifications at national, regional, and international levels to support the mobility of learners and workers. If I had to pause on that, that's probably the most important thing that Africa could take a lead on and that Europe is struggling with at the moment. This is the idea of somebody moving from one country to another country and having his or her credentials automatically recognized by the recipient country. I'm involved in a big project in Europe which is trying to use the blockchain. It's called the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure Project. And Europe is putting in millions trying to come up with technologies that can ensure the interoperability of credentials from one country to the next. It should be a no-brainer. As soon as you try and implement that, every single country in Europe does whatever it wants within its education regimes. Suddenly, the barriers of resistance are up. Maybe you can do something better in Africa. Okay? So, ensuring TVET is relevant to the labor markets, the acid test. I know, again, from my part of the world, because I do speak to the labor market occasionally, and they say, what do I do with these people universities rolling out if they have zero communication skills? They might be brilliant at what they do, but I can't put them in front of a client. How can I teach them about information disorder, fake news, all of this kind of stuff? Okay, maybe in Africa you could do a better job than what has been done in other parts of the world. I think the one thing, my first conversation with Olivier was, my feeling is you already know what the solutions are in Africa, but these need to be African solutions, not European solutions to the problem, because your context is different. You can only learn from the mistakes which have been made in other parts of the world. And I guess that's what my role is in all of this. Now, what's expected from you? I'm just chucking back at you what I've read. The purpose of the national network is to advocate for and support the acceleration of the digital transformation in your national TVET and skills development systems. The network will also facilitate, coordinate, and support the implementation of different activities of the initiative in their countries. Right. So can we agree then, as I'm, on slide 24, that the digitization of TVET and skill systems needs to be understood within this framework of change, but systemic change? I mean, can we agree that all of you are potentially change agents? In other words, I would suggest that if you're not prepared to be change agents, life might not be fun. And yet, if you have any desire to be able to change anything for the good, you're in a fantastic position right now as you start this journey of yours. Okay. So again, we need to think of the impact of technology on the different pillars of the TVET sector. So not just the teaching and the learning, but the governance and management of education and training institutions, and the way the labor market itself should be repurposing and repositioning to maximize any opportunities provided by technology and secure a better skilled workforce. Again, going back to these exercises right now, we have Olivier and Jose saying, we're running a session with the policy guys. That's you lot, I guess. And we're going to run a session with the labor market. And then let's, again, align. I think alignment is an important word here. Okay. So I'm just going to go through some screen grabs from a report, which, again, I co-authored now a couple of years ago, but listening to people like you from all over the world. And the report, it was anybody from, there were some people from Africa, and I will share some of those insights, but it was literally from Brazil to India to China. And I think the interesting thing was having commonality, common problems. So in a way here, even though I started by saying every country is different and your context is very different, yet there are some common problems irrespective of whether you're sitting in Brazil and you're working for the labor organization or a trade union over there, or you're working in Ghana, say, and you're running a private TVET organization. So what I'm going to share with you are some of these insights, slides, I guess, to again try and get you to start thinking about the journey. I think the first thing is this idea of a reflexive relationship. The reflexive relationship is when you have something which is changing something else. The other thing is also changing it. The reflexive relationship between digitization or digitalization, these words are used interchangeably, but between the digitalization sector, whatever that means, and the TVET and skills development sectors, whatever those mean. So if you have to look at digitalization, I guess techie, tech stuff, but could be anything from the internet to, I don't know, MOOCs, massive open online courses, technology in the classroom on one side. And on the other side, what is this movement called the TVET and skills development sector? Because there could be people who are, running the TVET institutions, people who see TVET as an opportunity for making money. By the way, we know that universities have not been good at doing what they were supposed to do. Let's try and find some other way, especially, and again, in my part of the world, because a lot of the discourse is about, 21st century skills. And here we are in 2021. I mean, I don't know if any of you remember the late Ken Robinson, who always used to talk about creativity in schools. Robinson died last year. He was saying the same thing for at least 15 years. And everybody, on his TEDx talk, I think there's millions of people have agreed with that. What have we done about stuff like that? Okay. But the reflexive relationship, digitalization changes, this kind of world changes, this world changes, more students, the labor market wants something, and technology also changes. Okay. One pushes the other, I guess. And again, not to be slightly academic about it, but I think we need to contextualize where we are in this kind of journey that we're taking right now. And if you think in terms of technologies, especially these kind of technologies we're talking about, which we are going to be using or planning to use, there have been waves of technologies and waves of mediatization. If you think about the earliest technologies we had, which were based on mechanization, the technologies which came after that, which was, electrification. And people say we've been in the digitization age for a long time. In fact, we're now in the datafication age. Again, I don't know how well you're going to see this. Don't worry too much about it. It's just something on a screen. What you have on one side here are dates from the 1400s all the way to where we might be right now. And the first major piece of technology innovation was the printing press. And whoever owned the printing press had a lot of power, whether it was a king or a bishop or whatever that might be. And not much happened in terms of technologies until the typewriter showed up in 1800. And then that started. And here in the second age, you're in this kind of, you're going from the mechanization age and very quickly into the electrification age. So went from the telegraph to photography to telephone, by the 1900s, the gramophone, and film and radio and the mobile phone. Yes, the mobile phone already there before the 1950s. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that you get waves of technologies, but also a lot of those technologies, which seem to be quite old, don't necessarily disappear. So film hasn't necessarily disappeared. We thought radio was going to disappear, and yet radio is now what? A podcast. So you keep on looking at the waves of innovation which started to happen there. What happened in a lot of your lifetimes, and many of you are much younger than me, so many of you might be digital natives, that as soon as you were born, technology was already around in some shape or format in your lives. Whilst in my case, I saw my first computer when I was 23 in London, and it was called the IBM Portable. It was about this big, had a screen like this, and I come from a previous life when we had pen and paper. But if you keep on looking at innovation, TV hasn't disappeared. Computers from the 1950s, except they're not the same thing. The ARPANET, which was the precursor of the internet, was around, literally, post-war. What happened was that we put this technology to good use as opposed to bad use. There was already technology to, help the US destroy its adversaries in the Second World War. What happened afterwards is that a lot of these technologies started to be applied both by the private sector and also, ironically, by the military. So by the time we got the PC, and I won't bore you with this, okay, things like the PC, CDs, how CDs have disappeared maybe, and yet vinyl hasn't. I come from a generation that, those old vinyl records, I thought, was very happy when CDs came in. I thought vinyl was going to disappear. And guess what? Years later, vinyl is a very precious commodity because we've gone to the World Wide Web, to social media, to smartphone, to back to TVET. I think the point I'm trying to make is these things we call technologies, sometimes you have to step a bit away and say, what's happening, what works, and also in places like Africa, where obviously I always hear stuff about the digital divide, lack of broadband, all of these other things. I have seen amazing things done in India with very rudimentary technology, but the will was there to try and use whatever technology was around, even if it's rudimentary, to put it to good use. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. So again, TVET, what we mean by it, I don't think we need to spend much time about this, but I think the idea of skills, learning to learn, development of literacy and numeracy skills, again, back to the transversal skills, back to these citizenship skills, being integral components. My advice to you is think of TVET as applied education, applied learning, filling the gaps that traditional education cannot fill in, being fully aware that in your part of the world, the gold standard remains academic education. And we are still at a stage where people would prefer their kids to go and get a degree from an academic education, even if the jobs are not around when they leave that institution. This implies a need for a cultural mindset. Okay? I'm going to keep on going unless, and I repeat, if there's any questions, pauses, or energy levels going down, and John, just let me know. So plumbing ahead. Tell me. I think I can hear something.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me just check the floor if we have any questions. May I check if we have any questions?
Angela, I can't hear anything. So I assume it's a question. What would people like to?
Alex, I think the participants understood your presentation very well, so I don't think we have questions or comments at the moment.
Okay. I'm going to keep on going.
Alex? Alex? Sorry, we just got one question.
Yeah.
All right.
Allô?
Hi.
Bonjour. Donc,
Good morning. I would like to thank Mr. Alex for his presentation. That is quite interesting. He talked about mutual recognition of qualification at national level, regional level, and even international level to enable more mobility of the learners. Now, my question, because we are very much interested in all this, and I would like to know if he could give examples, case studies, or how we can work around this. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting. John, I don't think you can mute your mic because I get a huge reverb in my ear, or at least I'm hearing.
Alex,
Tell me.
how about now? Because my mic was just muted.
Okay. I'm still hearing myself, but don't worry about it. Okay, now it's better. I think it's a really interesting question, and it is what we say is the holy grail of anybody interested in credentials in any part of the world. The problem is that, let me talk about my part of the world first, because it's one of the most complicated parts of the world, Europe, even though there's something called the European Union in many countries. Every single country in Europe can do its own thing. when it comes to qualifications, quality assurance regimes, and things like that. Now, Europe has tried to come up with standards in terms of qualifications, trying to peg learning to scales. So, for example, there's something called the Bologna process in my part of the world, which implies that, a PhD is scale 9, for instance, and all the way down to scale 0, you're like at, still at, just about to start school, and anything in between, you get scaled. Things are okay within your specific country, or at least in some countries, because, for example, in Germany, which looks at things regionally, it already becomes complicated to have one region accept what the other region says is a qualification. So let's start with this. We have a human governance issue, and it is all based on mutual recognition, which means it is up to the business of policymakers, people like you, to almost like strike deals. It's almost like strike bilateral deals if you were in the process of diplomacy, for instance. Now, what's happening, again, in my part of the world, but also in the US, is that people are starting to look at technologies, and specifically these decentralized technologies I'm talking about. One of them is the blockchain, where irrespective of what's happening on a regional political policy basis, the EU and the States in a certain way is saying, let's invest in technologies that make it patently obvious that it is easy to have even like a transcript of what a qualification is, and make this, however, belong to the recipient, not necessarily the issuing institution. Okay, so the technology is being built to enable citizens on the phone that whether they've done a course which was they got a BA in something, or else they went to the trade school and they learned farming, for all I know. Okay, once that certificate arrives, it is then literally turned into a digital format immediately. It could be a PDF. Now, some countries are using the blockchain to literally say, here it is, it's yours, you've got an encrypted key, don't lose that. But we already have the technologies that can enable us to get down to levels of a transcript of what those people have achieved. The problem is not the technology. The problem is human will. The problem is politics. The problem is countries agreeing amongst each other that a certificate issued in Ghana is going to be accepted in Senegal. That implies policymakers getting together, looking at the quality assurance regimes, and maybe set up a Pan-African regime, where at least you get these people to talk to each other. Now, Europe has been doing that for a while. So Europe has a head start, okay? It's got various regimes. They call the INIC, NARIC regimes, okay? I can bore you to tears with these things, but essentially, the ways of getting human beings to talk to each other about the need for the interoperability of credentials. And you need to strip it down to this. There's some very good literature about this. For example, Burhan Shakrun, James Keevy in South Africa has written about this. I've written about this. But it always boils down to human will, human networks, and human networks cannot be automated. You can have technology. The other bit implies the kind of journey you are starting on. So maybe that's not the answer you were looking for. There is no prescriptive answer, but I would start, for instance, seeing the journey that you're at. I would consider a Pan-African grouping of people who are in the business of quality assurance and certification to understand what you're going to try and do. And even if it's just looking at the TVET sector, they need to be on the table with you early on. I don't know if that answers the question.
Check if we have additional questions.
I can take, yeah.
Okay, Alex, give me 1 second. I think we have another question. Alex, I think we're good. But by the way, so here it's 10:30. Would you like to take a break for 30 minutes, or would you like to just?
I can keep on going with you. I think it's more important that you ask our colleagues that have been sitting down whether they want to have a break. So I'm ambivalent about this. I can go on for another half an hour if you wish and clear some material. Just please ask people over there. I'm fine with either. Henjan, I can't hear you. So if you tell me what the decision is.
So some participants, they want to just go on, but others they want to have a coffee break. So I just suggested that people can just go out, grab coffee, and come back, or you just continue. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'll keep coming. Okay.
Coffee. Okay, so sorry, Alex. So we're gonna have a coffee break right now, like now for 30 minutes. I think that's what most people want. Okay. So
we'll start in the... Okay.
And I'll message you later. Okay, so the coffee break is ready. So if you'd like to grab coffee. And Jose, are you suggesting 15 minutes? Because you need to tell me in advance.
We are here.
Yeah, 30 minutes. I said 30 minutes. Huh? I don't know. You need to tell me because.
Okay, 15 or 20.
Well, you need to know me in advance, though. So your coffee is ready, so feel free to grab some coffee and snacks, please. And we'll meet in 15 minutes, as Olivia mentioned.
And for English-speaking participants, please, you have received a mail from our colleague Abba with a form that you are supposed to fill. Do you receive the mail, please? English-speaking participants. A mail, you have just received a mail. Yes, this morning. Did not?
Non.
Ah bah? Tu as envoyé le mail au participant?
J'ai envoyé à certaines, pas encore à tout le monde.
Non, il faut envoyer tout le monde.
Oui, je vais envoyer à tout le monde, mais ça prend du temps.
Ah, c'est un à un?
Que je suis obligée d'envoyer ça un à un.
C'est même très pratique parce que les gens ne connaissent pas les signatures électroniques. Il y a beaucoup elle nous assiste aussi.
D'accord.
Ça va aller vite comme ça.
Je vais envoyer tout à l'heure à tout le monde.
Ok. Donc c'est un à un, tu vas faire ça? D'accord, pas de problème.
C'est un mail où on avait tout le monde. C'est
Un directeur national.
Oui, ça va, boss.
Comment tu vas? José, comment va?
Ça va très bien.
Matinée.
Non, ça va très bien.
Il y a des mails là où il y avait papier.
Est-ce qu'il y a une version française
Du document? Pas encore. Pas encore. C'est ça qui nous a envoyé. Donc, on va prendre le temps de traduire. Bon, c'est que c'est trop petit. Ça qu'on a quand même voulu partager avec vous pour que vous ayez au moins ça.
Mais est-ce qu'il y a également un document descriptif de ce qu'il dit ou en fait sous forme de description?
Voilà, oui, justement après la il nous a fourni des documents descriptifs qu'on va aussi vous remettre.
C'est le traducteur qui n'est pas tellement.
N'est-ce pas, le contexte. Oui, comme tu comprends les deux langues, tu compares. C'est ça le problème. Ah bah donc tu dis que tu vas faire un à un?
Oui, parce que je n'arrive pas à trouver les mails là où il y avait tout le monde.
Tous ces participants ici? Non mais j'ai le mail.
J'ai les adresses.
Hein?
C'est ce que j'ai fait.
J'ai tous les mails parce que je leur ai envoyé le document tout à l'heure à eux tous donc.
J'ai ouvert ça.
Oui. Non, tu peux envoyer à tout le monde en même temps, si tu le souhaites. Tu le souhaites?
Oui, c'est plus simple.
Oui, copie tout. Ah, bah, ne sais pas comment ça parle. Copie tout ça. Attends. Ouais.
Il y a les années.
Oui, même ça, tu peux séparer. Si tu peux faire deux groupes. J'ai annoncé un truc, alors tu n'as pas. Non,
Il y a beaucoup de...
non, comme ça, là. Allô.
C'est ça. Tu travailles dans la bibliothèque ici. Tout le temps dans la bibliothèque. Ah, donc tout ça, oui, ça ici. Ah, donc, mais on peut aussi jouer à parler là-bas, c'est comme ça. Oui.